Thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm Jamil Jaffer, and I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. Today, we're hosting a discussion on antitrust and the national security implications of antitrust. I'm thrilled today to be joined by a distinguished panel of guests, some of whom have been around this issue for longer than I've been working on these issues myself. And so I'm thrilled to have with us today a terrific panel. I'm just pulling up my notes here, so just give me a second. I'm running a little behind here. Give me 1 second. Thought I had that open. Here we go. All right. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Asheesh Agarwal, who serves as the American Enterprise Advisor on Antitrust and Economic Policy. Asheesh has served in senior roles in several administrations, including at the FTC and at DOJ, where he and I worked together. At the FTC, Asheesh served as Assistant Director of the Office of Policy Planning, where he led the committee's competition advocacy program and an initiative to examine regulatory barriers to the growth of e-commerce. Both in government and the private sector, Asheesh has litigated numerous high-profile cases and argued over a dozen cases in the federal appellate courts. We also have Oren Cass. Oren is the Executive Director of American Compass. American Compass's mission is to restore the economic orthodoxy that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. From 2015 to 2019, Oren was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addressed issues ranging from social safety net to environmental regulation. Prior to his time at the Manhattan Institute, Cass held roles as a domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and as a management consultant at Bain & Company in both their Boston and New Delhi offices. Evelyn Farkas is the president of Farkas Global Strategies. She provides corporate executives and boards of directors targeted advice on her assessment of global patterns and trends for opportunities and challenges. Recent years, she ran to represent New York's 17th Congressional District, and prior to that, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and had a number of other roles, both in the Department of Defense and elsewhere in the government, and was also, at one point, the Executive Director of the Congressional Commission on the Prevention of WMD Proliferation and Terrorism. So, Dr. Farkas, we're glad to have you with us. And last but certainly not least, Jennifer Huddleston. She currently serves as a policy counsel at NetChoice. She was formerly Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum. Jennifer's research focuses on the intersection, which we're going to talk a lot about today, of emerging technology and the law. Her work has appeared in a range of outlets: USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, Business Insider, Slate, and the New York Daily News. She's also appeared on CNBC and Fox Business. And so we're thrilled to have you here, Jennifer, also. So we've got a great panel, a great discussion. It's the fourth in our series of 4 events on this topic. And let's just jump right in. So Asheesh, when you served at the FTC, you had spent a long time in government working on antitrust issues, and you really spent a lot of time focused on it. So talk to us about some momentum that's going on the Hill, right? We've seen a lot of momentum building on antitrust regulation, potentially. What are the big arguments going on out here? And what can we see going forward in the next few months on these issues?
Well, Jamil, first of all, thank you so much for the invite. And thank you to the National Security Institute for putting a focus on these issues, which really are important to the future of the economy in the country. The impetus behind a lot of the legislation really starts a century ago with Louis Brandeis, who had this view that big corporations were inherently bad for competition, and also bad for society and the concept of democracy generally. And coupled with Louis Brandeis's views was what's come to be known as the Harvard School of Antitrust Law, which holds that the way to protect competition in a marketplace is to protect individual competitors. And the idea is that regardless of what those companies are doing for consumers, we need a number of competitors in a marketplace to preserve competition. Now, a lot of the legislative proposals that you're seeing today really flow from that thinking. So you have bills that would require the structural separation of many of our largest companies into separate components. You have bills that would make it difficult or outright impossible for larger companies to invest in startups, or just generally, dramatically increase the role of government in regulating, some of the large platforms and other companies. Now, interestingly, those views of Louis Brandeis and the Harvard School actually held sway in our country for about a half century until about the early 1980s, and they were abandoned really on a bipartisan basis with the Reagan administration and with Robert Bork's antitrust paradox, because those ideas were found to not be workable in practice and to be really damaging to innovation and harmful to consumers. So on the other side of this argument, you hear people say, we need to preserve first and foremost the consumer welfare standard. Antitrust touchstone should be first and foremost on consumers, because the government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers. You also hear people say that, antitrust law, works and is flexible enough to deal with any genuine competitive concerns from the platforms. So, for example, you have major antitrust lawsuits pending right now against Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. So people are saying, why would you need to rewrite the laws now when you have these lawsuits pending? And a big part of the concern is unintended consequences. Our economy has become the most dynamic in the world, in part because we have a very stable legal regulatory financing regime, particularly as compared to Europe. If you upset that balance by rewriting the laws, what's it going to do to innovation and what's it going to do to national security? So with that, I'll kick it back to you.
So, Asheesh, that's really helpful. Evelyn, I want you to help us understand, oftentimes we don't really think about national security and antitrust as things that sort of go together, right? Asheesh made the point about innovation and how important that is to our economic and our national security. Help us understand, why does what we're doing with respect to any of these big tech companies, right, or in the antitrust space generally, if we reform antitrust, what potential implications do they have for our national security? Why? And is there any relevance to our alliance relationships with our friends in Europe? Because they're active in this space also. Oh, you're muted.
So first of all, thank you, Jamil, and to the Institute for this opportunity. It is true. I'm not normally somebody who shows up at a meeting about antitrust. And I think the reason for that, the reason why we're worried about security now is because we're looking at a different sector, right? I mean, one of the people in the chat pointed out that actually trust busting goes back to Teddy Roosevelt. The target then, of course, was largely big oil, Standard Oil, and the railroad companies, which were working together. There's a very excellent big long book on it called Titan. And that was the impetus. And so security people like me didn't really focus on that because at the time we weren't talking about a global market and it was a very different industry. Today, we're talking largely about digital companies, and that's where we are running into a lot of potential danger from the national security perspective. We have a situation globally where the United States is in a standoff against autocracies, namely China and Russia. Right. And in the case of both countries, it's a political military standoff where technological innovation and economic capacity is important. There is a distinction between Russia and China in this realm. They both have the same objective, which is to basically undercut the United States and our allies, our economic and political allies. China is different from Russia in one major sense, which is their economic ability, right? Right. And so they can raise money. The state will provide and does provide money directly into the innovative arms of the Chinese economy, right? And that is a distinction also between China and the United States and our allies, although to a lesser extent with some of our allies. And that's why when you look at China and the innovation component of it, they're not going to ever be as competitive. We're not going to be able to compete the same way if we go to the point where research and development in the private sector is hindered by what we do on the antitrust front. So that's the innovation component. When we get to, strictly speaking, more narrowly speaking, security, there we have a lot of concern. And I have a piece that came out this summer in Politico on the US-European component, where the Europeans have passed something called the Digital Markets Act. They are trying to protect their own companies, frankly speaking, but unfortunately, they're targeting, basically the way they've written the legislation, they're targeting the big 5 US companies and opening the door inadvertently, I believe, to China and Russia. And so their legislation basically would require a whole host of things that companies have to do, to include providing proprietary information to other companies, to allowing a presence. So it creates, without going into the weeds, it creates a number of vulnerabilities. And I think, I don't want to monopolize the airspace here, and we can talk further about the details, but what I would caution is that because we're talking about digital industry, right? Because we're talking about something that's global and in the context of the standoff with China and Russia, we need to make sure that whatever legislation we develop, and I should be clear that I'm not against, trust busting, if you will, or legislation that increases competitiveness, in our economy and in the global economy. But we have to be really mindful that we do not cede an advantage to Russia and China, and that we maintain competitiveness in the United States, because our government right now isn't funding, the private sector isn't funding innovation the way the private sector is. There's a 1-to-3 ratio there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. So Jennifer, we heard Asheesh talk about some of these reforms that are going on. I'd love you to walk us through some of those. Evelyn just made the case, though, that look, it's not just innovation here, right? We need to make sure that whatever laws and changes that we make address innovation here. But as we're also thinking about what our allies are doing, right, that might have an impact on innovation here also, because as they apply their laws to us, right, we may have a challenge. And so talk to us about some of the stuff that's going on here in the United States. This is the panel on the home front. So talk to us about these. We got all these antitrust reform bills out there, right? What are they looking to do? What's the motivation behind them, right? We've heard a lot of talk, from both the left and the right for different reasons about why they're concerned about big tech, right? There's these claims that, there's suppression of speech on the right? You hear these claims about worker treatment and the bad behavior of big tech companies on the left, right? What does this have to do with antitrust, and what are these bills proposing to do?
We've seen, as you mentioned, a lot of different proposals, and to kind of follow on what Evelyn said, and not to make too much of a pun, I don't want to monopolize the conversation by going into too much detail on them, but there are two kind of major legislative packages, so to speak, that are currently getting attention. The first is a group of bills in the U.S. House of Representatives that went through a markup earlier this year. There are many different bills in this package that range from things that would update the filing fees related to mergers to things that are much more interventionary and would be significant changes from the current approach to antitrust enforcement. Right now, antitrust enforcement is largely based on a consumer welfare standard. Most of these proposals are looking more towards that European standard that was mentioned earlier, more towards things like the Digital Markets Act that would instead shift a focus to a presumption of wrongdoing for these largest companies, particularly when it comes to things like mergers and acquisitions, where there would be a shift in the burden and a shift in the presumption of what mergers would be allowed to go forward, as well as to things such as the ability to package products and services together, or the ability to even have generic brands on things like Amazon Prime or Apple's own apps in its app store. Those are what's going on in the House side. And most notably for this panel, there is a bill in that package that is very data portability focused. And I'm sure later on in this panel, we can get into some of the privacy concerns that can come from portability mandates when we're looking at the national security front. Then on the Senate side, you have Amy Klobuchar and led bill that again is looking at big tech specifically, but could have much broader implications in the future potentially. And again, is shifting more back to that big is bad concern. It too has some of these portability mandated elements in it. It's not as far as the separate bill in the House, which is the Access Act, but I think it's important to draw attention to these concerns, particularly when we are talking about national security, for what this could mean in terms of some of our global leaders having to potentially go away from what consumers want, which is a desire for more privacy, to instead having to hand over data to other players, not only competitors in the US, but potentially foreign adversaries in some cases, where they may have severe questions about what they're going to do with that data if it is handed over. I will also say, when we're looking at this more generally, when it comes to antitrust in the US and this potential shift to a more European model, we also have to consider that this really is a global market, that these companies are competing with international rivals. And so as we're having these debates, one of the debates that keeps coming up at time and time again, both in terms of what is the market definition regarding the service, but also what is the market definition in terms of, given the current geopolitical and global landscape, how are these companies competing not only with each other domestically, but with perhaps Chinese and Russian counterparts?
Right. What is the market? Right. So Oren, I think, Jennifer's made some interesting points and raised, this question of, we talked about big tech, right? You heard me use the phrase, you heard Jennifer use the phrase, right? I'm interested in your thoughts on what do we mean by big tech, right? Who are these companies? Why is there this concern? What's going on in the political dynamic? And are these bills that we're seeing on Capitol Hill, are they really aimed at fixing the problems that we hear being described? Because I hear these political concerns about quote unquote big tech, and they come from both sides of the aisles we talked about. But then I see these antitrust bills, and they, as Jennifer's laid out, that they may have this European aspect to them. Is that right? And if that's right, is that do we think big is bad is the right approach, or are we missing something here in this conversation? Thoughts?
Well, I think it's a great question, and thanks so much for having me. What I'm struck by in the comments so far is that I think there's a certain vagueness in how we're defining the problem or the concern. If I were to try to interpret it, and certainly others should correct me if this isn't right, it essentially goes, number one, tech and innovation are incredibly important to national security. No disagreement there. Number two, what we would call big tech, the companies in the tech sector that are the target of these monopoly concerns are somehow important to tech and innovation. And number three, therefore, we should be very concerned about antitrust or other regulatory measures that might disrupt them. Number two in that formula strikes me as simply incorrect. That is, the big tech companies that are the focus of antitrust discussion today are not ones that are making meaningful contributions to our national security, right? So Facebook, I think we should talk about companies here. Antitrust is a very fact-specific inquiry. If there's a way that Facebook innovation is vital to our national security, I'd be very interested to hear it. I can't think of one. Google, in theory, if it were doing good and important innovation, one could imagine, for instance, its work on artificial intelligence being vital. But of course, it in recent years almost simultaneously opened up an artificial intelligence center in Beijing while withdrawing from doing work with the Department of Defense. So we also have a problem that if you want to claim that you as a big tech monopoly are vital to the national interest, you actually have to act in the national interest, which we don't necessarily see today. And then third, I think we see a real problem where the monopolistic issues as we see them are really actually quite corrosive to innovation. If you think about companies like Google and Facebook in particular, they are deriving these massive profits at this point, not from actual innovation, but from rent seeking. And this goes to the market definition point. They're advertising companies. That's where the money comes from. And look, maybe that's fine. It's not a national security concern. And the reality is that we've set up an ecosystem at this point where the venture capital model, the talent model, the investment model is make a sprint to achieving a natural monopoly in some market to live off the rents. And that is directly channeling talent away and investment away from the kinds of innovation that would be vital to our national security. So in fact, last thing I'll just mention, Eric Schmidt, longtime Google CEO, has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today lamenting that we have fallen or are falling behind China on all of these vital areas. He says we're already behind in major areas of artificial intelligence, for instance, behind on 5G. Right. It's not clear to me how the big tech monopolies we have are in any way responsive to that. And so it's not clear why national security concerns should be raised as a defense of them in the antitrust conversation.
So these are important points, and I want to take each one of them in order. By the way, I should mention to the audience that we will be taking your questions. I already see a couple of questions in the question and answer area. We'll do that in about 15, 20 minutes. So please do put your questions in there and we'll get to them. But Evelyn, I want to start with Oren's first point, which was there's no real national security issue here. You've got companies that may not have any relevance to national security, right? Or we should talk about those. I know you and I, before we got on, were talking about doing meetings in the metaverse and what that looks like and the like. And so might that have national security implications, the technology there. But second, Oren makes a good point, right? Our companies are looking to compete globally. They're playing in the Chinese marketplace. At times, we've seen some of these companies push back on working with Americans, with the American government in particular. We've seen some things where employees have gotten upset. talk to us about these companies' role in national security and what are they? And then we'll talk about innovation too. And maybe that'll play into your conversation. Are these companies innovative? Are they contributing to innovation? But also on the pure national security point, right? Are they contributing to our government's effort, or are they helping the adversary?
Well, I don't want to go down a whole rabbit hole of discussing Facebook and the impact Facebook has had on our national security. But what I'm pointing to are some of the requirements that pending legislation, for example, in Europe or the US examples that Jennifer just talked about, require some interoperability. So require companies to transfer sensitive data to third-party providers without saying, but not the ones from China and Russia, and that's my beef, that we need a more thorough system before we regulate just so broadly. I'm worried about those countries getting access to sensitive data of US citizens, right? And frankly, citizens of our allied countries and partners around the world. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, they can get access, again, under the European draft law, to systems and tools operated by US companies, which puts sensitive code and design features potentially, in the hands, again, of Russia and China, because there's that big loophole. So it's not really about what Facebook or these other companies are providing. It's not just about the product, although I do think that in the case of Google, and some of the others, they are funding innovative research. And if they work with smaller companies, I represent small to medium-sized companies that are trying to break into another area where large companies dominate, which is the defense sector. In any event, I think the main point is not so much about the product, but more about the loopholes. There was a second part of your question, which I've now forgotten.
Well, it's okay. Actually, I'll let you let Jennifer talk about this one, and I'll come back to you, Evelyn, after I talk to Jennifer and Asheesh about this. But so one of the points I think that Oren made, and Oren should correct me if I get this wrong, right, is that, is where Evelyn ended, which is, these companies aren't particularly innovative. They're not doing a lot here. And so why are we trying to protect them? They're sort of rent seeking based on the natural monopoly that they've been able to utilize. So Jennifer, is that right? And if so, what do our history of antitrust laws tell us about this? And is that something we should be trying to address in these reforms that are being considered?
I always think it's interesting when we have this conversation in tech, because if we were having this conversation a decade ago or so ago, we would have been talking about how Yahoo won the search wars and what to do about AOL and who's going to catch Nokia. What are we going to do about, Nokia being the cell phone giant? And in many cases, these companies are now, much smaller if they exist at all, or what we've seen is that new competitors that were very small at that time ended up really being much more innovative than we might have noticed in the moment. That part of technology and innovation is that we can't always predict what that next giant leap forward is going to look like. We do see that these companies are continuing, because of the competition they are facing, to pour millions of dollars into research and design, not just because of technologies that may be focused on themselves, but also for what we benefit with it as consumers. And that sometimes those changes are so minor and so slight that we might not notice that, it took millions of dollars of AI research or machine learning research to give us a better feature on a product that we use every day. And when it comes to those smaller companies, what we've seen is that there is still a very diverse startup culture in the US. And part of that diversity is having a lot of different exit options. So there are small companies that want to be that next big thing, maybe something that we haven't even imagined, whether it's something that will then be a product that revolutionizes a consumer good, or to some of the companies that Evelyn's working with that may have a very good service for our national security, that are creating something completely new and independent. And their end goal is to take that to market and remain independent. There are other companies that are looking to improve an existing product and where an acquisition may be the best route for them. And the advantage of our current system is that we have a healthy culture that allows a lot of those different options. And that our current antitrust laws are focused on consumer welfare, which also analyzes analyzes these acquisitions and these mergers in a way of looking at things of how is that going to impact the consumer experience of the market. I think we sometimes in these conversations forget that we do have existing tools, that the issue is not that there are no tools if there is something that is anti-competitive and harmful for there to be an intervention, and that instead we want to look at, make sure that we aren't trying to intervene and more with government tools that are incredibly powerful into what is currently a competitive market, and perhaps in some of that robust startup culture that provides a wide range of options.
Yeah. Asheesh, I do want to come to you, but I actually want to go back to Oren for a second and have him respond to some of what's been said thus far, because I'm interested to know, Oren, we talk about innovation, we talk about whether these companies in particular are innovative, but Jennifer makes a really good point, which is, look, a decade or a decade and a half ago, we would have thought about MySpace or Friendster, right, or Netscape, right, and yet we, or Microsoft's domination with Internet Explorer, right, and yes, there were antitrust issues raised with that, right, but at the end of the day, here, IBM's not as big a player as what people might have thought, right? Microsoft's not there, although they're trying to become a bigger player, right? And yet we have these companies, Google and Facebook, and are they going to be replaced in the future? And isn't it fair to say that the current antitrust laws we have and the sort of fairly hands-off policy we've had to technology innovation over the last 2 decades has actually contributed to the massive innovation we've seen? And rather than sort of holding it back, we're actually seeing the growth that's even happening today.
That might be true. I think it'd be an interesting discussion, and I'm happy to get into it further. It has nothing to do with national security. And I think one thing that's striking in the responses from both Evelyn and Jennifer is that they essentially waive the argument that any of these concerns and stricter antitrust enforcement would have anything to do with national security. I think it's actually striking. I hadn't thought about it this way before, but Jennifer raising the consumer welfare standard as something we should be sticking to actually runs quite against a concern with national security, right? If we want to take national security into consideration in our antitrust law, which I think we should, that's actually a concession that the consumer welfare standard isn't sufficient. That as we consider the structure of our markets, the scale of companies, the trajectory of innovation, that just asking what produces the best, doohickeys for consumers can't possibly be a sufficient analysis. And so that's exactly why I think we therefore instead need to go back to the question and look at how the current role of these massive companies in our tech ecosystem either is or is not conducive to the kinds of innovation that would be good for our national security. I laid out several reasons why I think they're not only not helpful, but actually destructive, particularly in the kinds of innovation that they are and aren't pursuing, and what that does to the flow of talent and investment. So I'm still open to the argument that no, here's the reason why we need to sort of preserve or allow this sort of market power for national security sake. But I think someone has to actually make that case. Otherwise, it comes across more as essentially a sort of pretextual trial balloon floated by big tech. Hey, let's see if we can kind of get in under the national security umbrella. And I think what you're seeing here is actually you can't really.
Yeah. So Asheesh, let's talk about that, right? Because you served in the prior administration, and that administration for the first time put in writing that economic security is national security. We've always sort of understood that, right? It's sort of been a premise, but they put it in writing in the national security strategy. So to Oren's point, what is this connection between the need to allow companies to innovate and, are these companies the most innovative, or are they helping innovation? Are they funding innovation? And if they are, does that matter in terms of economic security? And does economic security matter to national security? Or is this just a made up sort of hopping over too many things, and it's not really about national security? It's about something else. What's your view on this? You were there at the FTC. Talk us about where sort of your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I would respectfully disagree with Oren on the importance of innovation in the private sector to America's national security. The Progressive Policy Institute put out a great paper recently, and I'll drop a link to it in the chat, talking about how much the private sector underpins America's ongoing innovation in things like quantum computing and 5G, and artificial intelligence. So just a few stats. So U.S. businesses fund 3 times as much R&D as the federal government. Amazon and Alphabet are leading the world in private sector investment. Microsoft, Google, and IBM are the only private companies among the top 10 research organizations in the world. And all of this goes to the point that the future is going to be the leaders in the future. It's probably going to be the United States or China. China has a plan, I think, to dominate the world by, I think, it's 2035 now. They are through state subsidies and industrial espionage and everything else they can do, trying to dominate these technologies. We've already seen dramatic examples in the pure military space of these hypersonic missiles, where they're well ahead of the United States, and that's something that should concern all Americans. Now, nobody is talking about immunizing the big tech companies from the antitrust laws. Of course, they should be held accountable, just like every other company should be held accountable. But what the concern is that we should not rewrite our antitrust laws in ways that would cripple these companies' ability to invest and innovate, or force them to structurally separate in ways that would eliminate their ability to invest. I would actually respectfully say there's bipartisan recognition of the importance of the private sector to America's national security. So, for instance, just this summer, President Biden hosted a conference at the White House with the CEOs of Amazon, Apple's, and others, in which those companies committed to ongoing cybersecurity investments to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. I think IBM committed to training more than 100,000 cybersecurity professionals in this country. It's the private sector that underpins the country's cybersecurity. Another example from the prior administration is Qualcomm. And Jamil, I think you and I have talked about this a little. So, the FTC brought a very aggressive lawsuit against Qualcomm. Qualcomm manufactures these chips that kind of undergird the 5G technology. The FTC brought a very aggressive lawsuit against them, challenging their global licensing practices. And the Department of Justice actually filed a brief against the FTC and said, no, this overly aggressive antitrust lawsuit is going to imperil Qualcomm's ability to continue to innovate and therefore harm America's national security. So you do have concrete examples of where the private sector's ongoing innovation is really critical to our ongoing national security.
Yeah. And Oren, I will come back to you to respond to Asheesh's point, but I want to ask Evelyn, one of the points that Jennifer made earlier on that we talked about a little bit with Oren was this idea that what's being adopted here in the US, or what's being considered for reform in the US, is sort of the European model, right? And you've spent a lot of time looking at European economies and understanding that aspect of it. Help us understand, is the European model innovative? Does it have the kind of innovation that we would want here in the United States, particularly as we go into this competition with China? And if not, what impact would adopting a more European-like model, if Jennifer's right, that's what it is, here in the US have on our economic and our national security?
Before I answer that question, I did want to answer respond to the second part of Oren's question, because I remembered it, which had to do with, big tech and their lack of patriotism or their inability real problem with that. So I would agree with Oren that we have seen these companies from the big tech sector where there's a lack of a culture of understanding. So the Google Maven program, where the employees were aghast that their company was helping the Department of Defense, essentially effectively target terrorists through the drone program, which the Department of Defense obviously funds and runs. And the leadership at Google was obviously supportive of the US government's efforts, but the employees weren't. And I think that's one example, but there are many examples where, and I don't want to pick on Silicon Valley because there's more to big tech than just Silicon Valley. And also even within Silicon Valley, there are more patriotic minded companies. But I think culturally for a long time in Silicon Valley in particular, there was a lack of appreciation for the fact that they are essentially, fighter aircraft sitting on a carrier, which is the United States of America, because the United States of America creates a safe environment for them to operate competitively. And so that I think is a point that I do want to agree with Oren on that. And these companies, the big tech companies, have to be mindful of those aspects of national security as well, that we are allowing them to be competitive globally. Now, getting to your point on Europe, that's why we actually need the Biden administration to engage more forcefully, if you will, with our European allies in the first order, because we saw this Digital Markets Act draft and apparently was discussed in the new US European Technology Council.
Right.
But the Europeans didn't take any action, from what we can tell, to change their draft legislation to address the concerns I mentioned already, basically the vulnerabilities that open the door to China and Russia because they're only targeting American companies, and European companies are not likely to jump into the breach immediately. It will be China and Russia that will jump into the breach. And so we right now are in a situation where the Europeans are diverging from the United States, although, again, as Jennifer mentioned, there's other legislation in the US that might be closer to the European model. But we need to sit down with the Europeans and really make sure that across the board we're aligned. I think it's similar to, in my mind, similar to what we do on sanctions policy. It's only going to be effective in protecting our mutual interests, which is in a democracy and in a liberal free market competitive economy, if we do it together. So I'm concerned right now that we don't have a really good way ahead with the Europeans. I'm unclear what our policy is because I haven't really seen the administration put anything out yet. We have all these pieces of legislation, but I don't think the White House is, you guys can correct me, the White House hasn't weighed in necessarily definitively in favor of one or the other. So I do think whatever we do, we need to do it lockstep with our allies and partners, especially the biggest economic partners. So the European Union, the Japanese government, the South Korean government, especially in tech, so that we don't cede the ground or provide an advantage to the Russians and Chinese economically, but again, more importantly, on the issue of national security, tech, privacy, all of these things that we don't want to see those countries gain an upper hand, because not to go down a whole nother path of conversation, but the way that they use technology in those other countries is according to a different set of rules. Right. Look at Xinjiang province, but right. Even Hong Kong and other parts of China. And we would like our rules to be the ones that prevail.
Yeah. So
when I say not necessarily US, but Democratic.
The Western allies, right? Democratic nations, right? So Oren, I want to give you a chance. I am going to go to questions from the audience, and Jennifer, I will come back to you in just a second. But Oren, I want to give you just a chance to weigh in. You have a concession from Evelyn there, right? That no doubt some of these companies have perhaps not focused enough on helping America's national security infrastructure at times. But what about the point that Asheesh and Evelyn both made, which is, and what Jennifer raised really earlier, which is, look, the place we don't want to go, right, is sort of the European approach to innovation. Europe has had innovation challenges for decades. It's partly because of the way that their laws and their systems are structured. Adopting their approach to antitrust seems like exactly the wrong direction. Are we getting this wrong here? Is that not what's going on here? And if it is what's going on here, what's the best response to that claim?
Well, I realize it's not fashionable to do this often on Washington panels, but I do have to start by saying I think that Asheesh just quite willfully misrepresented what I'd said. I opened my comments by specifically trying to follow the chain of logic and saying, look, there's no question that innovation is vital to national security. Mm-hmm. I would also agree that private sector innovation is obviously vital to innovation. The question that I keep asking is whether big tech as it's operating today is the right mechanism for pursuing that innovation. And that's where I still don't, frankly, see the case. As I mentioned, we have been using this model now over the past couple decades of saying like, well, maybe Google will invest in this in some, special research wing. And it's not working. We're falling behind. And so essentially what you have to believe that we need Google to be this agglomeration of advertising monopoly is to believe that generating massive amounts of cash through advertising, targeted advertising, and using that to fund research in advanced national security priorities is the right way to make progress. You can make that case, but I think if you just look at it in the abstract, that's a somewhat strange way to believe that we're going to achieve national security progress, and especially to believe we're going to get things like hypersonic missiles. I would suggest that if we had fewer of our top engineers, going into big data mining to addict children to social media, and more of them going into building hypersonic missiles, that would probably be a better way to make progress on hypersonic missiles. Now, to the question about what this actually means in terms of remedies, I think it's a little bit of confusing to say we're sort of heading toward the European model, in that I think on questions like privacy and data protection, certainly we might be. And I think Evelyn has rightly sort of said, that's an important but somewhat different discussion. I think she's made a lot of very important points about the dangers of telling people they should start giving their data out. But in the antitrust context, I think what you're looking at is very specific scrutiny of certain business models. And I don't know why we're not talking about Facebook, which is probably the one that gets the most focus here. But Facebook and the way it operates, and its operation as to some extent a natural monopoly, I think needs a response. And you could regulate it as a utility. You could look for ways to break it up. But that's not going down a European path. That is doing what the progressives trustbusters did a century ago, and saying we have new business models, a new type of economy, and we're going to need a regulatory mechanism that prevents these agglomerations of power that we don't want. In the context of Google, I think you look at it and say, what is the benefit to national security of the Google search engine and YouTube being part of the same company? And some of the other things that give it the leverage that it does over advertising. If you can make a national security case for it, fine. But it is extremely difficult for me to see how it benefits our national security to say that Google needs all of these different targeted advertising businesses bundled together.
Right. Well, so I do want to give Asheesh a chance to respond, but before I do that, let me ask Jennifer a question, because I did say we get to questions from the audience. So Jennifer, let me take a question from the audience for you, and then I'll come back to Asheesh and let him respond and ask him a question from the audience also. So one of our guests asked about one of the current criticisms of the antitrust bills, right? That they target U.S. companies, but not really Chinese competitors. That could ultimately improve the competitive position of foreign companies by targeting U.S. companies. What are some of the national security implications of excluding China's technology sector from U.S. domestic regulation? And is that what's going on here?
I think some of this conversation goes to what Evelyn has brought up several times about the broader market of, we need to have strong, innovative companies that provide a democratic alternative for a lot of these technologies, so that our allies do not feel that their only choice is to not have the most technologically advanced systems that they need, whether it's things like 5G or search, since that was just brought up, or whatever else, and that their only alternative is to go to the Chinese equivalent because they want to have more forward technologies. What we've seen is that the light touch approach to regulation typically pursued by the US has enabled a lot of innovation and has enabled kind of a continued competition in the global marketplace, that when you look at where the top technology companies are, there's a rather even divide between the US and China, but yet we haven't really had to have that market, that government intervention driving the market in terms of what we tell these companies their research and development needs to look like, which if you don't mind is something that I kind of want to respond to Oren on.
Please.
My focus is on the antitrust side, not as much on the national security side. So I defer to some of you with more expertise on that. But the way I look at this is also in the broader debate over industrial policy and what, if anything, there should be in terms of government intervention in the research and design process. And I think it is important to think about the fact that it is so hard to predict the direction that these things need to go, and that we've seen these conversations before as well around other technologies, only to see that the marketplace is able to respond as well, if not better, than a government directed strategy.
Yeah, it's an important point. Asheesh, I want to give you a chance to respond to Oren's claim that you misrepresent what he said, but I also want to ask you a question from the audience, since you were at the FTC, and this question is about the FTC. The questioner asks about the fact that we're seeing this sort of what some have called, I've called a pandemic in terms of cybersecurity, particularly when it comes to ransomware. And there's a call about for policymakers to do more to build trust online. And this questioner asks about the Access Act and says it requires companies to get FTC approval for making changes to their interface, which may have cybersecurity implications. So may make it harder, this questioner suggests, to rapidly fix cybersecurity challenges because you've got to get approvals from the FTC. Help us, as long as they don't meet this high bar of imminent risk. Talk to us about whether that's a real concern. And then if you'd like to respond to Oren's point, please go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so Oren, I certainly didn't mean to misrepresent anything that you said in my comments. I talked about how much Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, IBM, and some of these large companies are investing in technologies like quantum computing and AI, et cetera. I would refer you to that PPI study. I'd also refer you to a letter that was a white paper that was issued by some former national security officials, Leon Panetta, Dan Coates, Francis Townsend, and others, talking about how our largest technology companies really are important partners in protecting America's national security. And while I think you may be right that we are still falling behind relative to China in some of these technologies, such as supercomputers, I don't know that the answer is to break up Google, Facebook, et cetera, or to subject them uniquely to new antitrust restrictions that don't apply to their Chinese counterparts. So certainly happy to have further discussions about that on this panel or offline. Jamil, as to your question about the Access Act, yeah, I do think it's troubling. So writ large, I will say I do think that interoperability and portability are good concepts. They're pro-consumer concepts that would allow consumers to switch between services more easily, and I think that's a great thing. The problem is when you impose a government requirement on it, number one, you raise costs for smaller entrants that might not be able to meet all of the regulatory requirements that say a Facebook or a Google can much more easily meet. And number two, you are going to at least with the Access Act, my understanding is that it would require data to be shared with companies who are housed overseas, and that creates risks to Americans privacy. Do we want their personal data stored in servers overseas? That's part of it. But you also do create the risk that you touched upon, which is that companies might not be able to respond as quickly if they are compelled to seek the government's permission before they make adjustments. Jamil, you know this. From your own time in government, every day, companies are subjected to cyber attacks, from abroad, and quite frankly, they need to be able to respond in timely fashion and to protect the data.
Yeah. So Jennifer, I want to ask you about a point that Asheesh made, a point that you had raised earlier. One of our questioners asked about this issue of sensitive data, right, and portability and the implications it might have for sensitive data. One of our guests asked, what specific sensitive data can the Chinese get if there's data portability or social graph interoperability that they can't get through other means? We know there are these large data aggregators, right? We know there's these debates about government buying data for these data aggregators. Is there something that if portability were the rule that the Chinese or other governments would be able to get that they can't get today some other way?
It's hard to predict it in some cases, but I think the other question there is, does this make it easier for them to get that data? Of if something is more difficult now, if it requires overcoming certain cybersecurity elements. And of course, as Asheesh kind of brought up, there's a whole nother debate about whether or not there are greater cybersecurity needs in light of some of these issues. But if this kind of lessens that cybersecurity, where it's going to be easier to request as opposed to going through some of these processes, I think that should still be an incredible concern for most consumers and for most companies, and particularly for those that are involved in the national security debate, even if it isn't necessarily quote unquote different data that they might not otherwise be able to obtain.
Right. So, Oren, I have a question for you from the audience. One of our attendees asked about the critical shortage that we face in this country of skilled labor, and you've looked at the labor market problem extensively. And this comes in the context of unfolding cyber conflicts with China and Russia, sort of low-level stuff that we've seen, sometimes breaking out to a more problematic thing. And this questioner asks, is it wise for legislators and regulators to look to break up some of these companies that are providing the scale that's maybe necessary to train and employ workforces across broad areas of these digital skill jobs? What thoughts on that?
I think having the capacity to train more skilled workers is incredibly important. The question is then, what are they going to do? And the problem is that today, all of the economic incentives, because of the way we allow some of these markets to operate, is to focus on doing really efficient targeted advertising. If you think about the amount of talent that Silicon Valley is absorbing and the share of it that is going to these kinds of issues that we're concerned about, we have a real mismatch. Now, I guess you could try to make a sort of like merchant marine argument where we have all of these digitally talented folks doing this not very useful stuff, but should World War III break out, now we could quickly conscript them into a digital cyber court. I mean, sure, I guess that's a fun argument, but in practice, I think we have a real problem that the types of innovation that the market is rewarding in a market where we don't break up market power and where we allow these hundreds of billions of dollars in rents to accrue don't align with the national interest. And so, I would just briefly, because it really jumped out at me when Jennifer raised this in the industrial policy context, I think it's a great example. We're so used to falling back on this rhetoric of consumer welfare, of market signals guiding innovation. That's all terrific. It has nothing to do with national security. In fact, national security is the quintessential illustration of a place where the market is not going to deliver the needed innovation because there's no market for national security. So even if you want the government to solely play the role of sort of market purchaser, at the end of the day, it is going to be public policy and government policymakers that are determining the kinds of national security research that we need to pursue. And so, again, how do you do that well? Fascinating question, but it's such an interesting feature of this antitrust/national security discussion to try to conflate what is usually an argument about the power of the free market in the antitrust context with this area where I'm not aware of any theorist from any realm of economics that would say that the free market is actually going to deliver what you need in terms of national security.
So this is a point, I think, Asheesh, I want to ask you this, and I'm happy to have Evelyn or Jennifer weigh in on this also. So Oren has raised this point a couple of times, right? That, look, these are just ad-driven companies. All they're doing here is maximizing ad revenue, and they're hiring tons and tons of people and getting them to maximize ad revenue. And as a result, right, there's no real national security contribution here, right? But of course, some of this ad revenue is being driven by artificial intelligence and innovation there, and large-scale computing, and exascale computing that we now, you now can essentially get the power of what used to be a computer only the NSA could afford at the click of a button on Amazon, right? You can get these AI capabilities, both for VR from, some of Meta or whatever, and you can, Google's advancements in AI have moved the needle significantly, although we are, to be fair, behind on AI when it comes to the Chinese. Asheesh, is this right? Is this all this ad-driven stuff? Does it have nothing to do with national security? And is it just purely rent-seeking and a waste of time? And all these big companies, they're not contributing substantively to the national security realm by all the R&D money they're pouring into, whether it's AR, VR, or AI, or exascale computing. Is that right?
Well, again, I would respectfully disagree. I think all of those things adds to, the country's soft power, for one thing. I think it's a good thing that, for the country, that the world's leading search engine is Google, that the world's leading, social media company is Facebook, that one of the two world's leading, producers of smartphones is Apple. These are companies that are based, here in the United States. Their servers are largely here. They're subject to U.S. laws, and they're led by Americans. So I think that is all a good thing, and it's just interesting that these in some cases $1-trillion companies are being dismissed as just pure seekers of clickbait when they are leading innovations in things like the metaverse or self-driving cars or what have you. So I think it's a very good thing that these companies are based here. The marketplace is certainly telling us that. And I'd be very loath to adopt some sort of industrial policy that devalues these companies because some people don't see value in them.
Yeah. So Evelyn, let me ask you. Let me come to you on this question. So one of our guests asked about the fact that that one of the ways that the government is advancing its capabilities in machine learning, big data, and the like to confront China, Russia, Iran is through partnerships with some of these private sector companies, including some of these large companies. We've seen, obviously, as both you and Oren have pointed out, some big misses there where companies in response to employees have decided not to go down this road. But is it the case that in fact the government is working with private partnerships, and if they are these industries well protected against counterattacks from the other side? And if so, if not, what can the government and industry be doing better to address that concern?
What do you mean by counterattacks from the other side, Jamil?
So one of the things is, so we're hearing about this public-private partnership that it takes to drive machine learning, big data, and the like. One, is that true? And is that in part a response to Oren's point? And if so, are we concerned about the vulnerability of some of these private sector companies to attacks from China, Russia, Iran? We saw SolarWinds and the like. So how concerned should we be about that? One, is the premise correct? And second, if it is correct, should we be concerned about attacks from these foreign adversaries against these private sector companies that the government might be partnering with?
I mean, I think there is partnering between the government and private sector companies. I would argue there isn't enough of it, again, because our government is not on the cutting edge. And I say this as somebody who's looking at the defense industry. We need more commercial best practices coming into the defense industry. We need more partnering there. That's what I work on day to day. I represent companies that have new innovations, including in the energy space, which would help the environment and would cut down the cost of running everything that the department runs on fuel. It would transfer it to clean energy, and that clean energy, specifically flywheel, so mechanical energy, which can also be stored. And this is an example, but it's one where the taxpayer would save a lot of money, and we could put that money into a lot of other things, including research and development, which again, the US government itself is not funding adequately. And that is a problem, because I do think that to some extent, you are allowing private sector to pick and choose a little bit more than they should. This gets to industrial policy also. But right now we're kind of we have a hybrid system here where we have some private sector helping, probably not enough. And certainly it does make companies potentially vulnerable. All of the company, well, not all of the companies, but some of the companies I work with, or one of them, also sells products to China. And so there is a bit of a tension there. To the extent that they can focus more on working with democratic governments and democratic entities, I think it will help them hedge, frankly, against China, because I'm not optimistic about the relationship between US business and Chinese business down the road, maybe in certain sectors. So yeah. I don't know if that sufficiently answered your question. Maybe I just put a whole bunch of other concerns on the table.
Well, certainly, and there's a lot more for us to discuss. So I don't doubt that we'll probably have all of you back again for another one conversation. We are coming to the top of the hour, and I did commit to everybody that we'd finish on time. So thank you all for joining us. What a great conversation. Thank you, Asheesh, Oren, Evelyn, Jennifer, for being here with us today. For those of you in the audience, if you're on Capitol Hill this afternoon, please come to our congressional happy hour, talk about national security up at Union Pub at 5:30 today. And if you're around tomorrow, please join us for Congressman Mike Waltz and Jennifer Wexton talking about China and its human rights abuses and what to do about the upcoming Olympics. So thanks all. That's at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Thanks for being here. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having us.